News from the country's courts now, and murder-accused Ntuthuko Shoba was back on the witness stand yesterday at the Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg. And in fact, even today, Shoba has claimed to have not seen or recognized the man who killed his pregnant girlfriend the night she was picked up from his apartment. He is accused of ordering a hit on Pule in June 2020. Cross-examination began today and continued today on Shoba's version and denials of his involvement. Our reporter Govan Whittles has been watching it all. And Govan, tell us a bit more about this cross-examination of Ntuthuko Shoba that has continued today. Is he folding under pressure, under the scrutiny and pressure of cross-examination?
Well, he's trying not to Lesizwe, but he is starting to slip, and there are some clear cracks which have begun showing following the interrogation of Ntuthuko Shoba by prosecutor Mr. Mohammed. And Advocate Mohammed really zooming in on cell phone records. And this is important because being introduced as evidence here with two cell phones. The first, the smartphone, and then the second, one of the older models. And the second one was used to communicate with the confessed and convicted hitman, Malepane. The problem is, Thulasizwe, that the phones have been pinged by the prosecution and the police in their investigation, and they've always found to be in close proximity to one another. More than that, Malepane used the older model phone to, according to the prosecution, connect with Mr. Shoba, and that's how they planned the kidnapping and eventual murder of Pule. And he's painted a picture and revealed a pattern where Malepane would call the older model phone, and then a few minutes after that, there would be activity on the smartphone, which is registered to Ntuthuko Shoba, and he would then call Pule. And then, a crucial bit of evidence here, Thulasizwe, there is an instance where Malepane, the convicted hitman, tried to call the older model, which the prosecution says belonged to Ntuthuko Shoba, and that phone went to voicemail. And then immediately after that, the convicted hitman tried to call Ntuthuko Shoba on his smartphone, the number registered to him, and that number also went to voicemail. And then immediately after that, all of this within a space of 3 minutes, the older model phone then called Malepane back. And that, in addition to the phones being in close proximity to one another, has been very difficult for Ntuthuko Shoba to explain. His response to all of this was that he would refuse to comment with anything to do with the older phone because he disputes that that is his number, and that he views those cases of them being in close proximity to another in Florida Park, in Durban Deep, even in Deep Kloof, Soweto, on different occasions as pure coincidences. And then he hasn't been able to respond to the fact that he tried to call, or that the convicted hitman tried to call him on his registered phone number. And then another instance where Ntuthuko Shoba called the convicted hitman using his own registered phone. In that instance, he said that the convicted hitman had allegedly called Pule, or tried to make contact with her before she was kidnapped, and then he was simply calling to find out whose number this was. And when the person answered, he only heard breathing and no one spoke. So that's how he's denied that he's linked to that phone or its activity, and has dismissed the proximity of the two phones to one another as a pure coincidence. What should also be noted here, Thulasizwe, is that the prosecutor, Advocate Mohammed, had pointed out to the judge that Ntuthuko Shoba had extensively studied the docket as well as the processes by which the evidence is collected. He had studied the LLB for 2 years but didn't finish. And he also, as the prosecutor highlighted, studied criminal law. This was said at the beginning of his cross-examination, and once we got far enough into it, it became clear that the reason he brought this up is to demonstrate to the judge that they're dealing with an accused who had studied the docket extensively, knows the procedure through which things are prosecuted, and at many times Ntuthuko Shoba asking the prosecutor to stop and clarify which exhibit he was talking about so that they wouldn't be confused, and going extensively into the details of the phone records, even identifying the different codes and the numbers. So he's admitted to studying the evidence very closely, but he says this is to make sure that he's not tripped up and implicated, because of course he is still pleading his innocence. And then we also heard from the prosecution interviewing or questioning Ntuthuko Shoba about whether or not he had seen the convicted hitman before wearing a mask. This is important because Ntuthuko Shoba had admitted that he knew the convicted hitman. He claimed he only knew him because he wanted to buy cigarettes from him on multiple occasions when they were still banned during the lockdown. Conveniently, though, he says that the person who picked up Pule in that Jeep was wearing a mask and a cap on that night, so he couldn't tell who that was. And conveniently, again, he says that every time he went to buy cigarettes from the convicted hitman, he was never wearing a mask, so he wouldn't know what he looks like with the mask on, although Shoba says he was himself wearing a mask during that hard lockdown period of the coronavirus. So there are a few things where the judge has certainly raised his eyebrow and the prosecution has dug in deeper, and the defense has stood up to object, saying that he can't lead him to answer questions in a specific way. But after lunchtime, now that the cross-examination has wrapped up, there'll be re-examination, and it does look like the judge has a few questions for Ntuthuko Shoba, particularly surrounding those phone records.
All right. Thank you for that. That's eNCA's Govan Whittles out at the Gauteng division of the High Court, the Johannesburg local division there, giving us an update on that ongoing trial, the cross-examination of Ntuthuko Shoba.